I am Dr. Dorothy Njiraine from Women's Economic Empowerment Hub, University of Nairobi. I am the lead researcher for women's movement and self-mobilization. In this video, we are going to focus on Maimuna Mwidau. Kindly introduce yourself.
I was born in Mombasa, in this island, and I basically did my lower education throughout my lower education is in Mombasa. So that means primary, secondary, and up to A levels. I did it in Mombasa. So I basically am a child of Mombasa Island. After my high school, I went to university, to the University of Toronto, where I did my bachelor's in political science. And I was back in the country in 1996. And that was the beginning of the multi-party processes. Because when I left the country, I grew up in a one-party state. So I left the country there, only to come back that it had already changed. The Section 2 had been repealed. Yeah, so it was two different scenarios. But now I had grown from being a young girl and to a mature person in a different political environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Please tell us about your role in the constitution-making process.
I actually was employed at the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission as a national coordinator in the Department of Mobilization and Outreach. So our main activities were in organizing all the field activities, where we would take part in recruiting, organizing the district coordinators on the ground, facilitate meetings at the grassroots and at the national level with various stakeholders. So part of our work was to put in the structures that will now be used to engage the public. Most of the times we'll be recording the people who attended, some of the views being given by different groups of people, and share with the commissioners who are with us. So we did the administrative part of it, and that is how I first got engaged with the review process. But I was also engaged with the review process later, after the first referendum failed, through the League of Muslim Women. I'm a co-founder of the League of Muslim Women organization. And the reason why we co-founded the organization is because the Muslim women did not have a platform where they could be mobilized and engage in issues that affect them. So there were two ways that I engaged in the whole process.
Name the women leaders you may have worked with.
I worked very closely in the commission with the chair of the mobilization committee, that was Professor Wanjiku Kabira, and I worked closely with Mama Phoebe Asio, Commissioner Aliciano, Salome Mwidau. Those are the ones who are actively engaged in most of the activities within the commission and outside the commission.
Did you work with any men? If yes, you can name them.
Yes, most of the commissioners were supportive of all the issues that were in the Constitution. There was Professor Githu Muigai, Justice Lenaola, Keriako Tobiko, Ibrahim Lidhome, Ahmed Isaac, who was a former chair of IEBC, Professor Abdirizak Nuno. All these were in different committees. Dr. Mohamed Swazuri, who was in one of our committees when we did the fieldwork in Coast. Ambassador Ahmed Iza Salim, and actually he lives in Mombasa now, he's retired. Most of these were the commissioners that we worked specifically in the Coast region because of the ability probably of understanding the region very closely. And with the women is when it came to the women issues, we worked very closely together, yeah.
What stage of the Constitution did the women influence most?
I think from my experience, the women were engaged from the beginning to the end. Okay. And the beginning would be in the mobilization and forming the structures to create the platform where women would meet. Yes. And that is at the grassroots level, where committees were formed at each constituency. And each committee was comprised of at least a woman, a disabled, a religious leader, a youth, and other marginalized. So that was the first platform of engagement. And that committee was used to mobilize for women to come not only to discuss, but how to give their views how to identify the issues that were important to them. So that was the first level of engagement. It was very successful because that is also where the civic education was conducted, and that is where all the materials were distributed. So this is the first level of engagement. And it continued to the next level where we found ourselves at Bomas. Now that is where, after the grassroots, it is the district delegates who were identified from the ground who came to the Bomas. And I think you had Fatuma this morning. And this is how they were selected from each district then, which is county today. And they were identified to go and represent now the grassroots to the Bomas. Now, at the Bomas, there are also many different caucuses. There was a specific tent which was kept for women to discuss gender issues and to lobby one another from different regions. So the women from the grassroots continued the mobilization up to the Bomas level. Because at the Bomas level, there were different categories. There were professionals and the legal expertise, and then there were the district delegates. The majority was the district delegates. So the professionals understood the law, were able to educate the women on what the provisions need to be, what are the issues they can vote on. And that was, can I say, it's a two-way relationship. And the women from the delegates category were able now also to talk to their male counterparts to support these women agenda. So that is how they worked. And every end of the week, the delegates would meet in a particular hotel because they're all living in different hotels. They would meet to lobby with another group. For instance, if the Coast group have met and they've agreed, then they would go and meet the Nyanza group, or they will meet the group that is in central Kenya. That is how they operated. And then different political parties would also engage their supporters there on specific issues. But the women, the beauty about the women was that they managed to bring all the women together, irrespective of their religion, any other division, political affiliations. They all came together and understood that the women's agenda is the same wherever you are. And that is what brought all the women together. That even if you're in government or you're out of government, whether you're rich or poor, your agenda is the same. Your problems are the same. I think that's the reason why they were able to stick together. When they understood, we stand as one, as women. And that there were quite a number of men who were actually supportive. And they encouraged the women to engage with those difficult, maybe conservative men who saw no interest in women's issues. Yeah.
What about the referendum?
The women saw the opportunities, the provisions that were in those drafts.
Yes.
The women understood that if we have those provisions, there's room for expansion. For instance, prior to those new provisions, there were no specific seats for women in terms of leadership. The Bill of Rights was not there, so many of the rights were never there. The girls' rights, the women's rights, children's rights, they were not there. Provisions to provide for economic empowerment were not there. So this was something new that was going to open the doors for everybody, or rather trying to equalize a little bit in terms of opportunity, access to opportunities, rights, and empowerment. So that is what was driving the women.
What did you do to ensure that what women wanted was adopted in the Constitution?
There were many strategies, but women came together, the caucus, the alliance, and the various alliances that were formed came together and formed a working committee. And that working committee planned on the various activities. There were consultative meetings with stakeholders, such as the religious groups, other interest groups that were the churches. I remember we had SUPKEM, we had the churches, and then specific members of parliament. Each group was assigned. If I came from the coast, so I was assigned to speak to our members of parliament to gain support. So everybody did that in their own region. But the message was one. So it was not several different messages. There was only one message: support for women, provisions, and the Katiba in general. The other strategies was meeting with the parliamentary committee on the implementation of the Constitution. A lot of civil society organizations were organized to go and meet with the chair. I think that time the current deputy president was the chair, William Ruto, and Babu Namwamba, and quite a number. Martha was also in that committee, Martha Karua, Honorable Martha Karua. So we also went to meet separately with to lobby for the provisions in that particular committee. Okay. So those were the strategies to influence that the provisions are not diluted or are not removed or are not negotiated out. So that is the kind of support we provided. Okay. Then there was a group we also worked with Keopa closely to give support to the women parliamentarians who were there.
What of women in the religion?
Women in religion fell under the religious organizations. Okay. So they also participated in that category. Okay. Because not all women in religion supported those changes. Okay. Some had to be coerced into understanding so that they can support.
What about the activities at personal level?
I participated in some radio talk shows locally in Mombasa, where we would discuss issues in Kiswahili for purposes of engaging as many more who are not participating in the forums. Okay. I personally had meetings with various members of parliament, people I'm very familiar with. At that time, I also was engaged in party politics. So I had access to the leadership in Kano, and I was able to engage at that level. So everybody was able to engage with people they could access.
How did they access?
I can give you a few examples of the places I visited where we had some difficulties. These were places like Kisii, where we were mobilizing on the grassroots. And according to the culture there, women are not supposed to speak in front of men. Even the sitting arrangement was like you don't keep women and men together. They are more or less like Muslims, the way they behave. And the Muslims had similar problems. You don't mix the two. So you create forums where you give women an opportunity to speak separately, to give their views, and to coordinate amongst themselves. So the coordinators on the ground were actually facilitating women to get the information quietly through their own forums, because most of the public forums, it was a little bit difficult for them. However, in other places like Lamu, we were lucky that the women had access, and their members of parliament also helped us to coordinate a public baraza. And the women came fully covered in their buibui, but they were able to speak and give us their views. And they were also able to mobilize one another when it came to the referendum. Because the last call for support for the women provisions was a conference in Nairobi, where we brought in about 1,000 women, and we agreed as women to go out in our counties and constituencies and support the referendum, because it is giving us empowerment, because it is coming with goodies for women. And women understood that. And that is the reason why women came out in the largest of numbers to support the Constitution.
What of women politicians?
Women politicians at that point were not as many. I think we were going into the new transition. There were no women seats. So there were very few. But I remember Honorable Kitoni was very active in mobilizing, because she also had a lot of influence in Maendeleo ya wanawake. There was Honorable Amina. She was a nominated member of parliament. Quite a number of the senior women now who are no longer in active politics.
What of women organizations?
Women organizations, as I said, the Alliance, the Caucus, Maendeleo ya Wanawake, NCWK, National Council of Women of Kenya, and I forget the name of the professor. She was very active from the beginning, but hopefully I remember. But quite a number of them are now very senior.
What strategies worked for the realization of women's gain during the constitution-making process?
I think what worked most is the relationship between those who are mobilizing for support and those who are in the drafting process. Yeah, because in the drafting process, there were key women from the legal fraternity. Njoki Ndungu, Martha Karua, those were key players. And they are the ones who ensured even some of the way it was drafted, if it did not come out clearly, but it meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. Some of the male leaders were against certain straightforward provisions. So they had to be redrafted in such a way that they capture the provision but may not explicitly be seen to be what it is.
Would you refer to them as agents, or would they be influencers?
I think they are agents of change.
Okay.
Yeah, they are the agents of change because they understood both what the women were saying and they were able to interpret it from the legal perspective.
Okay.
Yeah.
What challenges did the women face during constitution-making process, and how did they overcome them?
I think the challenges were many. The fact that women were coming out to speak up about their rights and wanting them to be included into the constitution, that was a major change in terms of our society. So there were those who did not believe at all that women should have all these gains. So there was a lot of engagement in terms of exchange from very prominent, powerful people, which was very difficult sometimes to engage with. But because of the power of the large numbers of women, it became easier for women to engage. Those are some of the difficulties. When it came to voting, a lot of people feared that maybe women will be stopped from going to vote for the new constitution, because that is exactly what happens at the grassroots. Women are not allowed. But because of the momentum that was created, it became much easier for women to rally in the streets. Because we did at one point rally in the streets demanding our rights. In some rallies, the police beat up a lot of women. I remember very well Anne Njogu was beaten in the streets and put in a police vehicle. In other rallies, we were stopped on our tracks when we were marching to Parliament, and we were refused entry to see the speaker. But we were lucky that Martha Karua came out. She was told that the women are outside and they want to give their petition. And Martha Karua was able to come and pick the petition on behalf of the women and present it to Parliament. Okay. So those are some of the challenges that nowadays it's easy to engage the legislature if you want. It's a bit much easier than it was then. That was a transition time. These things had never been seen for women, from the younger ones to the older ones, to be walking down the streets and chanting Haki Yetu. It was not an easy thing, yeah. We overcame that by actually making sure we mobilized well. Okay. Yeah. I think mobilizing as many people who support an agenda and sticking together is the most important thing.
What are the most important women gains of the Constitution?
For me, who's a student of political science, I look at the space that has been created for women to take leadership. Because if that had not been done, that specific provision had not been provided for, then there will not be a mechanism to get women into leadership. Okay. Maybe the numbers would have been there, percentage would have been there, but if not, how it's going to be done was not in part of the provision, then that would have been difficult to gain. So that is one. Two, the devolution itself. It has also provided opportunity for women at the grassroots level to engage in leadership, to participate in choosing their leaders, but specifically having government closer to them. Because this is one thing that came out very clearly during the hearings, that we need the government to be closer to us so that the services can come also closer to the people. So those are some of them. The Bill of Rights, of course, which gives us a lot of rights. We can now enjoy those rights. It's liberating, I would say, from a perspective where you come from a strongly controlled, male-dominated society into one that has opened up the space. And there's room for expansion. That's the beauty about it. And the right to economic empowerment, the privilege for a mother to confer citizenship to their child, that's another right that I would say I grew up in a situation where I was conferred citizenship by my father. but my mother would not be able to do that because she was not a citizen. So it opens the doors for women, truly. And for the next generation, it may be much easier.
Suppose we talk about the economic gains. What would be your views about that?
On the economic gains, I look at the various opportunities that have been created, the funds in the constituency level, the funds at the county level, the Women Rep Fund, the Women Enterprise Fund, the Youth Fund. These are all new opportunities that women can take advantage of. Yeah.
What lessons can we learn from the women's mobilization and negotiations during constitution-making process?
The biggest lesson I would say is when people are organized together with an agenda, they can change anything. Because it is the women who came together with an agenda and they put forward the agenda, they were able to realize the change in the constitution. And anything else policy-wise can be influenced the same way. But women need to identify the issue, mobilize, and present that agenda to either the county government or the national government.
Now, how can these lessons which you have mentioned be used to promote policy change in women's economic empowerment?
I think it is important for women to continue mobilizing amongst themselves. And now we have women representatives and other leaders who support the women's agenda. Through those channels, women can mobilize and petition either their women rep, their legislators, their senators. They can use those models to make sure there's a policy change to influence economic empowerment for women. Just the way that women mobilize for political space is the same route they can use for economic empowerment. I think the one big lesson that I learned and that worked very well for the country is purely identifying an agenda for the women and rallying the whole country around it, irrespective of other divides, and being able to take that agenda up to the national level, from the grassroots up to the national level. That was the most powerful experience as far as I'm concerned. And that same system, methodology could be used to change other issues. Now, what happened is after we achieved those gains, I think the continuity is where was the biggest problem. And I still feel the network got disconnected, yeah, between those who went into those spaces that were created by women and the women who are outside. So that disconnect is what is the biggest failure, because the women need not rally anymore around the streets, because already that space was created, the leadership has come on board, and it's incumbent upon the leadership now to start during the legislative processes to open up those other avenues and not to start rallying again, but to also still maintain the support of the people on the grassroots, because that is the base of change. And normally in politics, you are as powerful as the people outside who support you. So I think there's a need to raise that awareness again, specifically because it has been 2 decades. The generation has changed. The younger ones who are 10-year-old today are 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds. They did not experience that. So there's a need to hand over the baton and create that momentum and let it grow on its own. Because if we lose that one totally, then the new generation will start all over again at the grassroots. And we may never have another constitution review process, maybe for another 50 years. So I think there's a need to recreate that momentum with those ones who are still around and hand it over to the younger generation and show them the experiences of what we went through, and this is how you create a network that will bring change. Yeah.